Hallo und willkommen. Have you ever tried to tell someone in German that you're taking a shower or looking forward to something, only to get stuck or maybe to say it wrong? These everyday phrases use something called reflexive pronouns, and they're absolutely essential in German. Today we're breaking down German reflexive pronouns, what they are, how to use them, and the most common verbs you'll need. Don't worry if they seem confusing at first. By the end of this video, you'll be using them with confidence. Here's the important part. German uses reflexive pronouns much more frequently and much more broadly than English does. This is why mastering them will instantly improve your German fluency. Let's look at the actual pronouns. German reflexive pronouns come in two cases, accusative and dative. Here are the accusative forms. For ich, we use mich. For du, we use dich. Wir becomes uns, ihr becomes euch, but then er, sie, es, and sie become sich. So this is a special reflexive pronoun that you can only see when we are using reflexive verbs. It's not used for any other purpose. Let's now have a look at the dative form. For ich, we now use mir. For du, we use dir. Wir once again becomes uns, ihr becomes euch, er, sie, es, and sie become sich. You may be wondering why there is even a dative form for a reflexive pronoun. And the reason is that outside of an extremely tiny set of verbs, like 7 verbs, no verbs can take more than one accusative object. So if there is a second object, the reflexive pronoun must be dative. If we look at both of these tables, we will notice that the pronouns are generally exactly the same as they would be for that case. So mich, dich, uns, euch are exactly as they would be in the normal accusative case. And in the case of the dative, it's the same. Mir, dir, uns, euch is exactly what the dative pronouns would be in this case. So we can see that it is definitely reflexive on the third person only. Third person singular and third person plural, where we see sich. You might be thinking, that's all very well and good. What do we even need reflexive pronouns for? They are the objects of reflexive verbs. In German, some verbs always need a reflexive pronoun, while others only need one sometimes. So if we take, for example, the verb sich freuen, to look forward to or to be happy about, this verb always requires a reflexive pronoun. You'll always see it with sich in the dictionary. Here are a few other examples. Sich interessieren für, to be interested in, sich gewöhnen an, to get used to, sich erinnern an, to remember, sich kümmern to care for, sich erkälten, to catch a cold, sich beeilen, to hurry. In this case, the sich, the reflexive pronoun, is not optional. They must be there. They're an important part of the meaning of the verb. It would be incorrect to leave them out. We have a second variety of reflexive verbs, however. These are verbs that are sometimes reflexive. If I take the second verb here as an example, I can say, ich wasche mich. I wash myself. Or I can say, ich wasche das Auto. I wash the car. The washing can have two kinds of objects. One is me, and if I wash myself, I need to use the reflexive pronoun. Please note that in English, I would never need to mention specifically that I wash myself, but it is important in German. The other is the car, and I can assure you that I am not a car. Therefore, no reflexive pronoun is needed here. The reflexivity is optional because the reflexive pronoun is not a must. I could kick you or I could kick myself, but I have options. It's not a must that I kick myself. You will need to memorize which verbs are always reflexive, specifically this group. This is not the whole group. There are more verbs, as they don't match up with English. We would never say, I remember myself on my childhood. Just not going to happen in English, but it definitely will happen in German. For more examples, check out our blog post about this topic. Now for some helpful tips to master reflexive pronouns. First, when using reflexive verbs in perfect tenses, they always take haben as their auxiliary verb, never sein. Sein is usually the auxiliary verb in perfect tense for verbs that cannot take an object. Think gehen, fliegen, schwimmen, etc. And by virtue of the fact that all reflexive verbs have a reflexive object, they cannot get in on the game of having sein as their helping verb. So, for example, we could say, sie hat sich erkältet. She caught a cold. We wouldn't say, sie ist sich erkältet. Sie hat sich erkältet. Secondly, when you memorize these reflexive verbs, memorize them in context, in sentences, and pay attention to the prepositions. For example, to be interested in is sich interessieren für, literally translated to interest yourself for. You can't just substitute other prepositions and hope for the best, unfortunately. Third tip, let's talk about word order. In main clauses or Hauptsätze, the reflexive pronoun usually comes right after the verb. Here we have an example sentence. Maria freut sich auf den Sommer. So we have freuen and it's been conjugated, freut, and directly thereafter comes our reflexive pronoun. That's where it belongs. But what happens when it's a Nebensatz, a subordinate clause? Here we have two options. First option, ich weiß nicht ob. So this is the beginning of the Nebensatz. Ob introduces a subordinate clause, and that means, what a subordinate clause really means, is that the verb must be at the end, at least in German. Ich weiß nicht, ob sich Maria darauf freut. Or, ich weiß nicht, ob Maria sich darauf freut. So we have two options. We can have ob followed directly by the reflexive pronoun and then the subject, or the other way around, ob followed by the subject and then the reflexive pronoun. Of course, we could be using other connectors such as das or wenn, which also introduce subordinate clauses. It will function exactly the same, and both of these sentences are correct. So there you have it, an almost complete guide to German reflexive pronouns. They may seem challenging at first, but with practice, they'll become second nature. And where can I practice them? You shout to the heavens. Why? On Clozemaster, of course. We have a reflexive verbs collection under German grammar challenges, so check that out and get reflexing. Danke fürs Zuschauen. Tschüss.